So now we begin to look at book 2 of the 13 books of the Confessions of St Augustine. And this particular book is only 12 pages long. It's quite short, yet it treats the matter, which many people encourages many people to, or attracts many people to the book of the Confessions, because it's the particular years and where a sexual awakening, when his restlessness brings him to do things which he is very ashamed of, which he has no problem speaking to God of in the presence of others. So just to begin to understand a little bit better the sense of what's going on in Augustine's life 16 centuries ago, we're talking about somebody who was a teenager, a young teenager, 16 years of age, and he had a year off from school. So perhaps if we could think, what did you, or what do you most dislike about yourself when you were a teenager, when you were 16? What was it like for you? Can you think of that? What did you dislike about yourself? It's important to put yourself in that position to think of that, because we're accompany Augustine in his relationship with God, with others, with himself, with nature, understanding himself as a person in relationship. And his conversion, which is the basic topic, the underlying conversion, and there are many of them, from one state to another during his life, the lifetime that he addresses to us in the book of the Confessions, is a conversion from as well as a conversion to. So a conversion to a deeper relationship with a loving God, understood as communion, as relationships, as caring, as reaching out, not an indifferent figure, but also a conversion from a state of being with which he is very unhappy, very embarrassed about. In trying to understand in public, in front of others, his family members and anybody who would take up the book, the reason for his faults. Augustine is a social being, and he explores, why do I do evil? What is it that draws me into doing these things? And it's more or less a concept of negative providence. We saw when we looked at Book 1 how Augustine was reflecting with joy and gratitude on divine providence, how he so much benefited from his background, his nature, his family, where he was brought up and how he was brought up. He saw God's blessings and wanted to encourage, and wants to encourage you and I today, to be grateful, to be good stewards of all the good gifts that God has bestowed on each one of us. But in this second book, very short, but enthralling at the same time, catching us up, it's a negative providence. It's what is taking him away from his true self, his relationship with himself as he now has discovered himself to be. It's displeasure. It's uncomfortableness with who he was and the ability to have been where he was. Particularly, he asks himself in the very second chapter of the second book, what was it that delighted me? Only loving and being loved. And he realized that it was pride that brought him to be so upset with himself, and the negative providence that he's realized the things that he had and who he was. He grew very weary of lifestyle with which he was caught up. His parents were involved in this. His parents, we saw, Patricius and Monica. Patricius, or Patrick, a minor Roman official. The Romans had 2 centuries previously conquered and began to inhabit that northern part of Africa, a colony. But by the time Augustine was born, the position which Patricius held in the town, a very small town, a couple of thousand people, that position was also a minor one. Not lowly, but not significant because it no longer came with patronage and wealth. It was a name. It was like being a member of the city council, a minor city in the empire, having some Roman blood, and his wife, Augustine's mother, Monica, being more of the indigenous nature. She was a Berber, we take to understand by her name, and by Augustine's relating her habits and her customs. She may have been illiterate, but she was certainly a pious Christian, whereas Patricius was very much a pagan, a person of Roman descent, and he would have worshipped the emperor, which is where Augustine gets his name, Caesar Augustus, the great emperor, and a pretentious name which they gave him, Augustine, a small emperor. Well, in many ways they formed Augustine in those early years, mother and father, to be somebody whose only concern was to learn to excel in rhetoric and persuasive speech. They wanted him to be educated. They wanted him to get ahead. And get ahead understood as to have a comfortable life, a secure life. So, well, we honor Monica, Saint Monica now, as in the case of Augustine, she had a journey as well. So, Augustine, 16 years old, idle, in between studies, from his boyhood and to his adolescence, he had this period of time when his father did not have enough money to send him off to get a better education, spending a lot of time around the house, a lot of time with friends. Augustine dwells on this concept, on this experience that he had of evil. Where did it come from? He was living at this period of adolescent lust. His mother, Monica, was reluctant to arrange a marriage for him because she feared that it might encumber his chances, economic chances, for the future. She counseled him to be very careful, that enter into adultery with a married woman would be very dangerous to him. And in the midst of all that, Augustine centers in on this one experience when, in the company of friends, he robs pears from a neighboring orchard. And he's very clear in the text that he had eaten pears of his own family orchard, which were much better than those of the neighbor. He wasn't hungry. He didn't do this because he was in need. And he questions of why would I do this? What would bring me to steal pears, eat a few, but throw them away, throw them to the pigs? That wasn't that I needed them. And he examines, he goes up and down over this. I simply wanted to enjoy the theft for its own sake, and the sin, he says, not to feast on ourselves, but perhaps to throw to the pigs. We did eat a few, but we derived pleasure from the deed simply because it was forbidden. So what moved him at that point in time still disturbs him many years later when he's writing this, dictating this to the scribes. That what really moved moved him to do? Why did he do it? It's likely that he found it very hard after his series of conversions to understand, but he placed this before God, which I hope you and I can place before God with sincerity. Our faults and failings, realizing that we have been and continue to be blessed in so many ways. We have no reason to envy anyone else because God has given us the gifts which he has given us for the purpose which we need them. Enough. And the attitude, the proper attitude of response is gratitude. But we know that we don't always live in that particular way. Our relationships are not always as healthy as we would like them. So, an exceedingly unfriendly form of friendship is what Augustine remembers of that adolescent period. That the more we relate, the more truly like God we are, entering communion and sharing, but entering into relationship with selfish people, self-centered people, people who look out for their own good rather than the common good, is exactly the opposite of that. It's turning our back on God, turning our back on others, and turning our back on ourselves, dominating nature rather than administering it, caring for it, being responsible stewards. So why do we do evil? Without reflection, census, greed, pride, envy, lack of care, concern for others. It's relationships, how I relate to myself, how I see myself, how I understand myself. If I understand myself as gifted and unmerited of the many gifts of being loved, well then I'm less likely to share. And so, being from the home that he was from, a pagan Roman descended father and an indigenous Berber mother, he understood what it was to live in a household of two cultures which were clashing, two ways of seeing the world, a person in whom clashed these cultures. So home was for him hybrid. He didn't certainly find at that age, at that time in his life, in adolescence, late adolescence, the tranquility with himself, knowing who he was before God, beloved, loved, needed in order to share God's love with others. So he considered himself and calls himself in this second chapter a poor wretch. O good God, creator of all things, more beautiful than all of them. He says, those pears we stole did have a certain beauty because they were your creation. Yours, O God, who are the highest good and the true good for me. Those pears were beautiful, but they were not what my miserable soul loved. I had plenty of better ones, and I plucked them only for the sake of stealing. For once I picked them, I threw them away. I feasted on the sin, nothing else, and that I relished and enjoyed. Even if some morsel of the pears did enter my mouth, it was only the criminal act that lent it savor. This is what he is reflecting on, what brought him to do that. Curiosity, which poses as the pursuit of knowledge. Ignorance or stupidity masquerading as simplicity or innocence. Sloth, which pretends to aspire to rest. These are the things that are masquerades, not authentic and not sincere. And so Augustine says in chapter 14 of book 2, a soul that turns away from you lapses into fornication when it seeks apart from you that what it can never find in pure and limpid form except by returning to you. So he returns to that original phrase with which the very first chapter, the very first paragraph begins in the first book. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So what did I love in that theft? What was I looking for? What was I searching for? And he says it. He acknowledges it. He acknowledges that he is forgiven, that God has forgiven him. But I recall my state of mind at that time. And he clearly says, I would not have done it alone. I certainly would not have done it alone. I also love the camaraderie with my fellow thieves, that gang mentality. It was not for love of the pears that I stole. I simply wanted to enjoy them. I could have done it alone, but since my pleasure did not lie in the pears, it must have been in the crime as committed in the company of others who shared my sin. I would not have done that deed alone, he repeats. In no way would I have done it alone. To do it alone, he says, would have aroused no desire whatever in me, nor would I have done it 7 times in 3 paragraphs. 7 times, he repeats, I would not have done it alone. What an exceedingly unfriendly form of friendship that was. Who can unravel this most snarled, knotty tangle? It is disgusting, and I do not want to look at it or see it. We may have and may continue to experience similar sentiments. But hopefully we can take away from this our reflection that the power of allowing others to influence us without being in touch with ourselves, without being in touch with God in us, without looking at others as objects and not as people with will, with whom I am called to relate, and not merely to follow or to lead, but to enter into a healthy relationship of dialogue, of respect, of searching together for the common good, of sharing the fruits of our search for the common good. So the challenge in this second book is to recall that we are on the way. We are not yet at our destiny. We are called to grow in holiness and wholeness, to become ever more faithful to our call to communion, to live in relationship, to know who we are, and to place our gifts and ourselves at the service of others, particularly those most in need. This second book, when it's already passed from infancy to childhood and now into adolescence, we realize that Augustine has lived a troubled life, blessed in many ways, but troubled in the clash of cultures in his own home, the clash of desires in his own heart, the lack of understanding of his true role in the world as a person in relationship to others. If we can identify with that, hopefully we'll be able to share those feelings, not hold them in, but talk to others. Have good friends with whom we can share our thoughts. Talk to God in the silence of our hearts, bring our thoughts and desires as well as our wishes to God, and listen to God as God speaks to us through others and through Scripture, through the teaching of the Church. I encourage you, walk this journey, walk through Book 2, walk with others, share the journey with those you love.